When you're trying to play the opening, you need to be ready against annoying gambits. They're out of the box from the main theory, but they still exist and your opponent can surprise you. For example, this weird gambit in French defense is very popular in online blitz and rapid. Let me show you and guide you how to better counter this with black. I will show you a rare line which would help you to beat this gambit. My name is Paolo Martinov and welcome you to my YouTube channel, and let's start. So this gambit appears after e4, e6, knight f3, d5, e5, c5, b4. Very popular approach for white in blitz and rapid, as I mentioned. And instead of going c takes b4, trying to follow the main lines of white, I want to come up with the interesting c4 idea. Very rare move, but you can surprise your opponent. So the pawn is hanging because we want to go bishop takes b4. And white is about to play a3 or c3. The main line according to the theory is c3, but I think that a3 is even more poisoned. Because what to do now? Black have an options. First one is to play a5, which basically leaves to the position like this: b5, knight d7, d3. Yeah, we are about to play f6, by the way, at some point. d3. And here, what's the idea of white? If you takes on d3 in this position, then like something like this can happen. f6, typical French idea. d4, takes, knight h6. Yeah, we don't need to afraid bishop takes h6 in this structure. After gh6, we will comfortably play bishop g7, attacking the pawn on e5, following by the castle, because the king would be secure because of the bishop on g7. That's okay, definitely. But instead of taking, white can play bishop d3. This position could be playable. You can still play like bishop c5, castle, knight can go to f5 or f7 in some case, but honestly, I like this better for white because of this pawn structure, which gives white a space advantage. That's why I don't want to go to this position. And returning back in the situation after d3, the very typical idea of white, because they need to counter this advanced pawn on c4, I want to come up with the pawn sacrifice b6. That's a really interesting approach. What is my idea? In case of I want just to play bishop b7, right, to develop the pieces. So after takes, I want to go knight e7. White planned to sacrifice the pawn, but we sacrifice the pawn finally. The idea, like in the line bishop b2, bishop b7, takes, we definitely have a compensation because of the weaknesses in white structure. The c line, I mean the c2 pawn and so on. Our bishop on b7 on long diagonal brings us the nice compensation. We will put the knight on c5, bishop on e7, we will do the castle, and this position would be really good for us in my vision. I don't see the reason why you don't need to go for this line. And returning back to the a3, the move number 5. If you don't want to sacrifice the pawn, then you can try a tricky computer line b5, which basically again a rare approach. The idea is that we want to play a5 and prevent b5 by white. So d3 looks like the most logical for white, a5. And here the position is very, very complicated. Never been played according to the Lee Chess Masters database. So you can try this during the games. I will show you one example line which is very sharp. Knight goes to c3. Bishop d7, we want to protect the pawn on b5. Takes, and knight d4. So the b5 pawn is hanging, and we want to play queen b6. Bishop a3, a takes b4, and white have an approach queen f3, attacking the rook on a8. This line is strictly like computer one, but amazing. Amazing that it's draft to the endgame like that. Takes, knight b5, queen c6, white need to capture, and after bishop takes c4, knight h6, I believe this position is completely okay. We want to play knight f5, so black have lots of chances in this endgame. But for sure, it's an example line. The theory after b5 is not discovered yet, but you can still shock your opponent with this rare opening approach. So that's what was related to the 5-move a3. And now I want to come up with the c3, which is still the main line for white. And here I like the move a5, so I want to force b5 to play knight d7, because our knight can have this nice spot in the future. And as well, we are looking to play f6 in some positions, as we mentioned before. So white better play d3, because d4, for example, is less flexible. For sure, we can just play c takes d3, and that would be that would transpose us to the line d3. But as well, we have a tricky idea a4. So we really want to move the pawn till to the end, a very typical idea nowadays, right? And in case of, for example, knight a3, trying to block it and maybe to transpose the knight for some better square in the future, white will face f6. Takes. After bishop e2, I mean, knight h6, yeah, and we want to go knight f7, bishop c5 or e7, castle. This position is very nice for black, as I see, because the bishop on e2 is really restricted by the pawn structure. And again, in case of take, we don't need to be scary of this. The e5 pawn would be a weakness. Black has a very rich game in the future. So that's why it's better for white to play d3, so which is basically not forces even us to take. We can still play queen c7. It's an interesting sideline that is possible. So for example, bishop f4, because white needs to protect the pawn on e5. Knight e7, takes. Now, like on bishop e2, I can play b6 following the bishop b7. Again, interesting position that is not discovered yet. On something like knight d2, I can play knight d5 in this position because it's a double attack. Again, rich and interesting. If white's trying to play tricky knight fd2 because this pawn is protected now, I can think about knight g6 or knight d5, then following by knight b6 protecting the pawn on c4. So this line is, again, very, very okay for black. I don't see any trouble. That's about the interesting approach queen c7 on the move 7. But we still can go c takes d4, c takes d3, I'm sorry, bishop takes d3 and the f6. And this position is also interesting, like takes, bishop f4, knight goes to c5, bishop goes to c2, bishop goes e7, following by castle, and yep, typical French structure with this hanging pawns in the center. White has also troubles with the structure on the queen side. We have a very nice spot for our knight. Interesting. So you can choose between this line and queen c7. But this position should be tested more and more in the future, definitely, because it's very sharp and interesting, and rare as well. So now you know how to play against this gambit as black, and you can surprise your opponent with this c4 advancing in the very beginning. They will definitely spend the time, which would be priceless for you.